the people who now talk endlessly about Israel. They talk endlessly about anti-Zionism. They talk endlessly about globalism, right? So globalism is, this, or the deep state, something very similar, shadowy figures, shadowy bankers, which is why I think the tie to and why I was focusing on this book, because I had long noticed this when reading kind of the speeches from the 19th. I think one of the things that not first really convinced me is the historian, and I recommend listeners and viewers buy this book after only you buy Brendan's book, is Peter Longerich, who wrote a very good biography of Goebbels, in which the first 500 pages is, you would think it was a Marxist university professor. I mean, a man on the left of the party, and if those of you don't know, there was a left wing of the Nazi party, the Strasser brothers, who were these famous kind of leftists. Goebbels, very, very left-wing, and in complaining to Hitler about things that ruin the socialism of a particular program. And this is as late as 1930 and 31. You kind of crystallized that in this book, that Adolf Hitler's real focus was not to discount Bolshevism, Judeo-Bolshevism, et cetera, is the United States and anti-capitalism, which is something that if you pay a lot of attention, you notice this all the time. Now, I know we have political debates about this, whether the Nazis left-wing or right-wing, completely irrelevant in a stupid political debate for contemporary purposes. But I have noticed that so many of the people on that side of the American argument today have gone kind of left on economics. Steve Bannon is, a socialist as far as, he told me after I interviewed him one time how much he loved AOC. Tucker Carlson has drifted away. They hate this libertarian, Cato Institutes, free market stuff. And so I do see these parallels, which are kind of curious. Talk to me a little bit about that focus. You're not the first person to have written about it, but you're the first person to have kind of focused it on the Anglo-American thing, particularly American thing, and anti-capitalism. Why do you think that anti-capitalism is one of the sort of main motivating features of Hitler's ideology?
Yeah, well, to be clear, Hitler had a very strong aversion to communism and a very strong aversion to the Soviet Union. But what I argue in the book is that his fear of and hatred of the United States, the British Empire, and international capitalism was even greater. It was also periodically a love-hate relationship, so it's a complex relationship. But he's much, much more worried about British and American power than he is about Soviet power. And he's much more afraid of international capitalism than he is of communism. In fact, he regards communism, along with many other isms, socialisms, trade unionism, and so on, as instruments which are used by the forces of international capitalism to break down national economies and make them subject to the forces of international capitalism, which are both Jewish and non-Jewish. He specifically says that.
Yeah.
But obviously, anti-Semitism is a large part of this, but it is not just about anti-Semitism. Now, the reason why he thinks this is actually perfectly straightforward. It is true that the British Empire and the United States, taken together in the 1920s and 1930s, definitely have the preponderance of power in the world. Hitler was not alone in thinking that. That's a reasonable proposition. And it is also true that international capitalism was a very, very powerful force, the most powerful force, certainly than the other forces out there like Soviet communism and so on. Now, I personally think that was and is a good thing. Not everybody agrees with me. That in itself is not a bizarre belief. But he then sort of escalates that belief to a whole worldview which blames all the ills of Germany on this Anglo-American elite and on international Jewry in a way which strips out many, many other factors. That's where it becomes incredible and noxious. Of course, he is, to a considerable extent, reacting to his own biography. He has fought in the First World War for 4 years. Most of that time was spent fighting the British. He's got a huge respect for the British. He thinks they're the toughest race, basically, in the world. He thinks the Anglo-Saxons are the true master race. He thinks that the Germans have, in a sense, degenerated over the centuries and, in fact, need living space in the East to provide themselves with that sort of racial energy and quality, which the British and later the Americans have acquired through their control of large amounts of the world's surface. So he comes out of that war, at the tail end of which, by the way, he also has to confront American soldiers, whom he believes to be German immigrants. We might go into that in a minute. But he comes out of the First World War convinced, not unreasonably, of the overwhelming power of Anglo-America and international capitalism, which he blames for the war. Then he experiences the Versailles settlement, he experiences the reparations regime, he experiences the occupation by the French and the Belgians, all those things which basically turn Germany, in his parlance, into a colony. In fact, he talks about Germany in highly racialized terms. He compares the Germans to the non-white peoples who've been colonized. And so that is why concern with Anglo-America is front and center. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, is the product of a sickness. So the reason why he fears Bolshevism is as a sickness which will disintegrate Germany, has disintegrated Germany through the revolutionary activities of 1918 and delivered up Germany to the forces of the Entente and international capitalism. So these are all reasons why he's much more afraid of the British Americans and international capitalism than he is of the Soviet Union and Bolshevism.
And it's an interesting thing, considering, the Munich Soviet after the war and the violence that was associated with it. And, the presumption that all of these people are being directed by Moscow, that this is literally right in your country now. And then there's other Soviets popping up and violently being put down after the First World War. But, one of the interesting things is, I get the the idea and the argument of what the Soviet Union represents. But if you're looking at, Hitler's speeches, if you're an average person picking up a copy of the Völkische Beobachter and reading, the Nazi newspaper, what is the difference if you're an anti-capitalist and if you talk about capital in that way in the United States, in international finance capital, in Jewish capital, et cetera? Mm-hmm. What is the kind of ideological distinction when you're also talking about Bolshevismus, about Bolshevism, Marxism, not socialism, that's never coming up. But Marxism, Bolshevism are denounced in just a blanket way. Explain to somebody who might not understand how you can be a kind of pretty open and rock-ribbed anti-capitalist denouncing kind of bankers and international finance and also be denouncing Marxism and Bolshevism.
Mm-hmm. So Hitler described himself as a socialist. Now, he was not, of course, a socialist in any meaningful sense of the word today. So, or even in the past, say, people like Willy Brandt or any other, present-day socialist leader in Europe, or dare I say it, in the United States. Yeah. So I'm not saying this in order to blacken socialism. I'm just saying that he regarded himself as a socialist because he believed that nationalism and socialism essentially went together, that you could not be a nationalist and a capitalist, because if you're a capitalist, you're essentially international. He used that phrase. He didn't actually use the phrase globalist, but the nomenclature is very similar. They actually mean more or less the same thing, which also tells you something interesting about present-day debates. And Hitler is not against all forms of capitalism. That's why I always stressed his real enemy was international capitalism. He specifically says on a number of occasions, I'm in favor of national capitalism, by which he means companies which are rooted in the German Reich, companies like Krupp, for example, they are okay from his point of view. International capitalism, Wall Street, finance, those are the real enemies. And so that's the way in which the anti-communism and the anti-capitalism can be reconciled in his mind. And he specifically says that the concern with Bolshevism is that it's subversive, as I said earlier. It's basically, it's breaking down national economies and weakening them in the face of this international threat.
And is there a racial element of that too, of that the German folk don't matter in an internationalist communist context, whereas, you know, the racial purity in blood and these blood and soil kind of stuff doesn't matter at all to communism, or doesn't seem to matter at all. Is that a part of it too?
Yes. So communism, in his mind, is sort of negation of, because it's internationalist, is a negation of nationalism. But he doesn't regard the Soviet Union after a certain point as irredeemably Bolshevik. So one or at least for a while not. So one thing that's interesting is when Litvinov is got rid of as foreign secretary and Molotov comes in, this is taken by Hitler as a sign that Stalin is moving away from Jewish communism to a more nationalistic model, which, although a cockeyed view of the world, is not completely ridiculous at some level. And this is a huge problem, by the way, when you're studying these phenomena, because there will always be, or there will often be, some kernel of truth or plausibility to the story. And then you've got to, but the overall interpretation is just completely bizarre. And you've got to try and trace how you get from what appears to be reasonable to something that is fantastical.